Libertarian socialism is pre-industrial anarchism. All anti-private property anarchism is pre-industrial anarchism. You see these types of movements come about just as a place is entering an industrial revolution. And I'm not sure what's so special about the conditions just as a place is about to enter an industrial revolution, but there seems to be a correlation between the flare-up of anarchist movements in an area as an area is just entering an industrial revolution. This kind of happened in Britain, although not so much in Britain as Britain was the first country to industrialize. France, Italy, Spain, as Spain was starting to industrialize. Russia, as Russia was starting to industrialize, although Russia took a unique turn. Not so much Germany, as Germany was unifying as they industrialized. Same with much of Eastern and Central Europe. But the example that I like is Britain. And just as Britain was starting to industrialize, I recall about 80% of the land was owned by about 5% of the population. Why would this be? Well, it was because those 5% were part of the political class. They were politically connected and could acquire land grants from the state directly or indirectly. I'm simplifying. There's all sorts of ways to use the state to acquire property or make it easier to acquire property, but it was this political class that got the land. Those people owned the land without having necessarily made any improvements to the land. And so if some farmer just wanted to move on to the landlord's land and farm, he had to pay a rent to this landlord. Many Britons recognized this as arbitrary and unjust and wanted to abolish the landlords, which they called private property. And to abolish this private property, you had to abolish the state. The reason for this is because Europeans on the whole couldn't imagine non-exploitative private property ownership. And this is understandable because they had never seen it before. In the United States, you did have something resembling a free market with emergent property delineations. And so you didn't see anti-private property anarchism in a big way like you did in Europe. This is because in the US there was basically just land and people and not a whole lot of state control. People went into an area and made deals with each other about how to divvy up the land, and then when groups came into contact with other groups, they would synchronize their criteria for land ownership, including how many improvements per acre, how long fields could be left fallow and ownership retained, easements and management of water rights, all that stuff emerging with spontaneous order. Because of their experience with true private property, Americans didn't see private property as inherently exploitative like Europeans did. If I were a libertarian socialist, my response to this claim about the American experience would be that this period in American history saw the usage of Proudhonian property rights. The reason the U.S. was so nice in certain areas relative to Europe is because for much of its history it was predominantly libertarian socialist, in which case I would call myself a libertarian socialist as far as that goes. The problem comes with this idea of wage slavery. The idea of wage slavery goes like this. If you work for a wage under a person who owns the means of production, you are being exploited. This is because by using his capital, you are producing a product that is worth more than the wages paid, and the owner of the capital pockets the difference in the form of profits. Throughout most of human history, this is a compelling and valid argument because throughout most of history, the capitalist, that is the owner of the capital stock, was simply given the factory or land or money for the factory or whatever based on his political connections. And this money came from taxes. And the taxes were paid by the working class. So the working class was forced to, at the point of a gun to make an investment in the factory, and the political class gets to reap the profits. In that sense, the likes of Mr. 1001 Nights do have a point, and that is why the early anarchists made this mistake. And when you understand the times and places where early anarchism came to be, the mistake makes perfect sense and is totally understandable. But it's still wrong. In a free market, the difference between capitalist and worker is not about political access, but about time and risk preference. That is, the capitalist is willing to take risks and sacrifice present consumption in order to acquire capital. He would also not be able to extract profits from the labor of his factory workers greater than those of the other capitalists, because the capitalists will be competing with each other, and the capitalists will not be able to acquire insane luxuries that they have today. because if they take too much from the company, instead of reinvesting in more efficient production, they will go out of business and have their market taken over by someone who is willing to go without a private jet. The initial sacrifice of time, additional labor, and risk that the capitalist makes to start a firm will be rewarded to the extent that other people are not willing to make those same sacrifices, just as a mailman is rewarded to the extent that other people are not willing to become mailmen. Today, this dynamic is not played out, as the politically connected can secure barriers to entry to shield from competition, they can socialize their losses, and even get bailouts from the state, thus allowing them to acquire and maintain capital without having to do the work to do so.